Imagine a battlefield where steel burns hotter than fire, where the inside of a tank becomes a furnace in seconds, and where survival is not measured by strength, but by the choices made in moments no longer than a heartbeat. Now imagine a man who has already escaped that furnace, a man whose hands are burned, whose lungs are filling with smoke, whose body is telling him to run, but who turns back. Not because he is ordered to. Not because it is safe. But because two men inside that burning tank are still alive, and he refuses to leave them behind. This is not a legend, not a myth, not a story polished by time. This is an event recorded in wartime archives, remembered by witnesses, and echoed across the armored forces of the Second World War. A tank struck. Fire everywhere. Ammunition seconds from detonating. And one man climbing back into the flames. What drives a person to do that? What does bravery look like inside a steel coffin filling with smoke? What does loyalty mean when every instinct screams to save yourself? In this video, you will hear the story of a real tank crewman who did the impossible, who broke the rules, defied death, and rewrote the meaning of courage in a single, unforgettable act. This is not a tale of glory. This is a testimony of what ordinary men can become when the lives of their brothers depend on them. This is the story of the man who went back. He had been born into a world still marked by the scars of the First World War, though the adults around him rarely spoke of their experiences directly. Their silence was its own testimony, one that shaped the childhood of those who grew up in the late interwar years. He saw the way the older men paused when loud machinery echoed in the distance, or how they shifted uneasily when the topic of borders and treaties arose. From an early age, he understood that something vast and destructive had recently passed through their lives. What he did not yet grasp was that something just as devastating was approaching again. His family lived in a rural region where work was constant and expectations were simple. Strength, discipline, and endurance were valued more than dreams. When he turned 18, Europe was already moving toward another conflict, though many refused to see it until it was too late. When war was declared, he was one of the many young men who didn't question the call to service. It seemed inevitable, almost natural, that he would join the armed forces. What he did not know was that he would soon become part of a profession that demanded equal parts courage, mechanical skill, and an ability to remain calm under pressure that few could imagine. He was assigned to the armored forces, not because he had any particular desire to serve inside a tank, but because the Armored Corps required thousands of new recruits and he had the physical resilience and quick reflexes that instructors sought. Tanks in those years were simultaneously symbols of modern power and reminders of the limits of human engineering: heavy, slow to repair, vulnerable in certain conditions, but indispensable for breakthroughs and defensive actions alike. To enter a tank was to enter a metal shell where the noise was constant, the heat suffocating, and the margin for error razor-thin. Training was brief but relentless. New recruits were taught that their tank was a tool, not a fortress. They were instructed on how to maintain the engine, how to load ammunition under stress, how to operate in darkness or under fire, and how to execute emergency evacuations in situations where seconds meant survival. Recruits were drilled to replace tracks in mud, to identify enemy armor silhouettes, and to communicate silently when noise drowned out the intercom. Every movement had to be efficient. Every action had to be repeatable even when wounded, exhausted, or terrified. The instructors emphasized one principle above all: a tank crew survived not because the armor was thick, but because the crew acted as one. Coordination mattered more than physical strength. Trust mattered more than rank. They were told stories of crews who lived because they followed procedure with precision, and stories of those who died because a fraction of a second was lost to confusion. Among the lessons that stayed with him most clearly was one delivered by an instructor who had fought in earlier conflicts. That instructor said that when a tank caught fire, chaos was the true enemy. The first 10 seconds after a strike could determine whether the crew walked away or became casualties. The instructor warned that entering a burning vehicle to rescue others was strictly forbidden unless ordered or absolutely unavoidable. The risk of ammunition detonation, fuel ignition, or collapse of internal structures was simply too high. He absorbed these lessons mechanically at first, but they would later define the most important moment of his life. When his unit was deployed to the front, he discovered quickly that training only approximated the reality of armored warfare. The battlefield was a landscape of noise, smoke, and sudden, unpredictable violence. Tanks were often the first to advance and the last to retreat. They operated under conditions where visibility was poor, where terrain hid anti-tank weapons, and where communication with infantry was frequently disrupted. Every operation demanded endurance, long marches followed by intense bursts of combat, repairs under fire, sleepless nights spent preparing for the next battle. His crew changed several times during those early months. Casualties, transfers, and hospitalizations were frequent. With each replacement, he found himself teaching new men the small techniques that could save their lives: how to notice the change in engine sound when a fuel line was failing, how to brace properly to avoid spinal injury during abrupt maneuvers, how to open the hatch without exposing oneself unnecessarily to sniper fire. Through this process, he gradually became one of the more experienced crewmen in his unit. The first time his own tank was hit, the shell struck the armor at an angle and failed to penetrate, but the force of impact was enough to disorient the entire crew. Fuel sprayed inside the engine compartment and ignited. They executed emergency procedures exactly as trained: extinguishers applied immediately, hatches opened in the correct sequence, movement coordinated to avoid blocking exits. They escaped. The tank was damaged but reparable. It was a lesson in fragility. A tank that seemed indestructible from a distance could become an iron coffin in seconds. He witnessed the wrecks of armored vehicles along roads, fields, and forest edges, each marking the point where a crew had fought and lost. Some had burned completely, leaving nothing but a shell. Others had suffered internal explosions that scattered fragments across meters of terrain. These wrecks were studied by surviving tankers not out of morbid fascination but out of necessity. Understanding what had gone wrong meant increasing the odds of surviving the next engagement. Word spread within the armored core of incidents where crewmen had risked themselves to save others. Some of these stories came from official reports, others circulated informally between units. He heard of a loader who carried his wounded commander from a burning vehicle despite suffering severe burns himself. He heard of a mechanic driver who rescued 2 crewmates before the ammunition detonated. He heard of those who had attempted such rescues but died in the process. These stories were not celebrated with fanfare. They were simply acknowledged as part of the grim reality of service in armored units. He never imagined that he would one day become part of such a story. As the war progressed, his unit was relocated to a sector known for intense anti-tank defenses. The enemy was skilled in constructing concealed firing positions, using terrain to funnel approaching armor into kill zones. Tank crews operated with a heightened sense of caution. They advanced in staggered formations, maintained strict discipline in scanning terrain, and avoided unnecessary halts. The commanding officers reminded everyone repeatedly that a stationary tank was an easy target. During one operation, his unit was tasked with supporting an infantry advance across a series of ridges and wooded areas. The goal was to break through the enemy's defensive line and push toward key logistical positions. Reconnaissance reports suggested the enemy's anti-tank assets were located deeper behind their primary line, so initial resistance was expected to be light. For the first phase of the operation, this assessment proved correct. His tank moved steadily along its assigned route. The infantry advanced behind them. The air was filled with the usual noise of artillery in the distance and sporadic gunfire. The ground was uneven, but the tank responded well. He monitored the engine, the gauges, and the terrain ahead, performing his duties without conscious thought. Experience had made everything feel routine. Then the situation changed abruptly. As the tanks crested a shallow rise, they entered a zone where the enemy had prepared overlapping fields of fire. The first anti-tank round struck a vehicle in the formation ahead, disabling it immediately. Before the crews could react, more shots followed, targeting the tanks as they attempted to maneuver. His own vehicle was hit on the right side by a shell that penetrated the armor. The force of the impact spun the tank slightly and sent debris flying inside the cabin. Fuel ignited almost instantly. He felt the heat before he registered the sound. The compartment filled with smoke. The commander beside him was thrown against the interior wall, suffering severe burns and temporary blindness. The driver slumped forward, likely unconscious. The loader struggled to free himself from equipment that had shifted during the impact. Flames rose quickly, feeding on spilled fuel and ruptured components. Training should have dictated his next actions. The proper response in such a scenario was to evacuate immediately, assist crewmates if possible, and retreat to a safe distance to avoid the likely explosion of ammunition. The manuals were clear: re-entering a burning tank was prohibited. The risk was too great. Ammunition could cook off unpredictably. Internal structures could collapse. Smoke inhalation could incapacitate a rescuer in seconds. But in situations like these, theory and reality often diverged. Through instinct more than conscious decision, he climbed toward the hatch. The heat seared his arms and face. He pushed himself out of the vehicle and dropped heavily to the ground. For a moment he struggled to breathe. The world around him felt distant and muffled. He could not hear the gunfire that surely continued nearby. He saw the burning tank as if through a haze. He crawled a few meters away, coughing violently as the smoke cleared from his lungs. When he finally turned back toward the tank, he saw movement inside the hatch. The commander was trying to pull himself out but lacked the strength. The loader was still trapped. Flames poured out of the opening. The air shimmered with heat. The risk was obvious: the tank could explode at any moment. No one would have blamed him for staying away. But he knew that two men were still inside. He forced himself to stand. His legs felt unsteady, his vision blurred, but he moved toward the burning vehicle. Years of training told him not to do it. Instinct told him he must. He had served with these men for months. He knew their voices, their habits, their strengths and weaknesses. They had saved his life before, and he could not abandon them now. Approaching the tank was like moving toward a furnace. Heat radiated outward with intense force. He avoided the side where the flames were strongest and climbed toward the hatch. Metal burned his hands through his gloves. Smoke stung his eyes so severely that he could barely see. But he reached inside and grasped the commander's arm. The commander was conscious but disoriented. With great effort, he pulled him up and over the edge of the hatch. The commander's uniform was smoldering, and his hands were blackened from burns. He slid down the side of the tank and collapsed nearby. There was no time to rest. He returned to the hatch. This time the flames were stronger. Smoke poured upward in thick columns. The interior was barely visible except for the flickering orange light that illuminated pieces of equipment and shattered fragments of metal. The loader was lying against the side of the turret, pinned by debris. He was unconscious. He leaned inside, holding his breath instinctively. The heat was almost unbearable. He grabbed the loader by the shoulders and pulled with all his strength. The man's body barely moved at first. Something was trapping him. He repositioned himself, straining against the weight of the debris. His lungs screamed for air, but he did not withdraw. Each second increased the likelihood of ammunition detonating. He managed to free the loader enough to drag him upward. The effort felt endless, yet he refused to stop. At last he heaved the loader toward the hatch. The man's body was limp. Pulling him out required every reserve of strength he had left. He lifted the man onto the edge of the hatch and then maneuvered him onto the tank's exterior. His vision darkened around the edges. He forced himself to slide down the hull while keeping hold of the loader's clothing. Both of them fell heavily onto the ground. He dragged the loader away from the burning vehicle. His legs barely supported him. His breath came in ragged gasps. He moved a meter at a time. Then another. Then another. Only when he was sure they were far enough from the wreck did he allow himself to collapse beside them. Moments later, ammunition inside the tank began detonating. Sharp bursts echoed across the battlefield. Flames shot upward in arcs. The vehicle that had been his home for months was now an inferno. Medics arrived shortly after, alerted by infantry who had witnessed the incident. They tended first to the wounded commander and loader, both of whom had severe burns and smoke inhalation. Then they turned to him. His hands were blistered, his face reddened and swollen, his breathing strained. He was barely conscious. They placed him on a stretcher and transported him to a field hospital where he remained for several days, drifting in and out of awareness. He was informed later that both the commander and the loader survived because of his actions. The driver, who had been closest to the explosion's impact, never regained consciousness, though he had died before the flames consumed the tank. The medical staff spoke quietly about the incident. Some expressed shock that he had gone back inside. Others simply nodded, understanding that armored crewmen often faced impossible choices. When he returned to his unit weeks later, those who knew what had happened greeted him with brief acknowledgments. There were no ceremonies or speeches. War did not allow for extended reflection. Tanks were needed. Crews were needed. He resumed his duties, though with bandaged hands and lingering pain. His fellow crewmen, those who replaced the wounded commander and loader, looked at him with a mixture of respect and curiosity. They knew his story. They also knew that survival in tank warfare depended on such unspoken bonds. In the months that followed, he found himself serving not only as an experienced operator but as an informal instructor for newer recruits. Commanders sometimes directed him to speak to fresh crews during orientation. He described the importance of discipline, the need for constant awareness, and the reality that a tank could become a death trap in seconds. He never embellished the story of his own experience. He simply explained what had happened and why he had acted as he did. He emphasized that every man must decide for himself whether to take such a risk and that no one should ever feel shame for choosing survival in a scenario where the odds were overwhelming. The war dragged on. His unit participated in numerous operations, some successful, others costly. He saw more tanks burn, more wrecks litter the roadsides, more wounded carried away on stretchers. Each incident reminded him of the day he pulled his comrades from his own burning vehicle. He carried the memory with him, even when he tried not to think about it. When archival records were compiled after the war, his actions were documented with clinical precision. Reports noted that he had re-entered a burning tank in violation of regulations but had done so to save 2 wounded crew members. They described the conditions of the hit, the nature of the fire, the timeline of events, and the injuries sustained. The language of official documents was dry, detached, and entirely inadequate to capture the reality of that moment. Yet the essential fact remained: he had acted without hesitation and had saved lives. He never considered himself a hero. For him, the incident was not a story to be told for admiration. It was simply something that had happened, something that any man in his position might have done. When asked about it years later, he would say only that he had been part of a crew, and a crew was a family. You did not leave family behind. In the weeks that followed the incident with the burning tank, the rhythm of the war seemed to pause around him while the rest of the front continued its relentless forward motion. His injuries were not severe enough to remove him permanently from service, but they required a recovery period during which he remained physically present in the field hospital yet mentally still on the battlefield. The medical staff moved quickly and efficiently from one cot to the next, and he came to understand that his condition, though painful, was far from the worst they saw each day. The burns on his hands and face healed slowly but steadily, and the smoke inhalation left him weakened, though not incapacitated. During this time, he became aware of the administrative process that followed any event deemed unusual enough to warrant documentation. Officers visited him to gather details for after-action reports. Their questions were methodical, each aimed at reconstructing the sequence of events inside the tank. He noticed that the officers asked in a neutral tone, neither praising nor criticizing his actions. They simply needed clarity for the record. He answered in the same manner, sticking to facts and omitting any attempt to interpret them. The officers wrote quickly, nodded politely, and moved on to the next case. The war demanded constant documentation, even of acts that defied instructions. He saw the commander and the loader only briefly during his time in the hospital. They were housed in separate wards due to the extent of their burns. He caught glimpses of orderlies moving between rooms with trays of medical supplies and heard whispered updates from passing nurses. The commander was slowly regaining sight in one eye, and the loader's breathing was stabilizing. These small improvements reassured him more than any official statement could. The knowledge that they were alive created a sense of closure that allowed him to focus on his own recovery. When he was eventually discharged from medical care and returned to his unit, he discovered that the frontline had shifted in his absence. The wreckage of his tank had long since cooled, been inspected, documented, and eventually stripped for reusable parts. What remained of the hull was pushed aside to clear the route for advancing vehicles. War had no capacity for nostalgia. Even the machines that had carried men into battle were recyclable material once they could no longer serve their purpose. His return to the unit was subdued. There were nods of acknowledgement from those who knew what had happened, but little else. The men were tired, focused on their tasks, and burdened by the weight of continuous operations. He blended back into the environment quickly, almost invisibly, as though he had never been gone. The only real difference was the way the new crewmen looked at him. Word had spread through the battle group, and he sensed a shift in their posture when he approached, a mixture of quiet respect and curiosity. Before being assigned to a new tank, he underwent a series of evaluations to determine his readiness. Officers inspected his physical condition and his ability to perform essential tasks. They noted that his grip strength had weakened due to the burns but that his coordination remained intact. After several days of assessment, he was cleared to return to full operational duty. The new tank to which he was assigned was not markedly different from the one he had lost, though small modifications had been introduced to improve fire safety and internal ergonomics. He spent hours familiarizing himself with the vehicle, checking every component from engine manifolds to ammunition racks. His new crew observed him quietly as he worked. They recognized the practiced efficiency in his movements and understood that he carried experience that could not be taught in any formal school. The early days with this new crew were characterized by the necessary period of adjustment. Each man brought his own habits and expectations. As they trained together, the unspoken language of armored warfare gradually emerged among them. They learned how to anticipate one another's actions, when to trust intuition over instruction, and how to operate as a cohesive unit. His presence helped to accelerate this process. Without seeking authority, he provided steady guidance whenever uncertainty arose. His approach was factual and devoid of personal pride. He focused on survival, on discipline, and on the small routines that prevented catastrophe. A few weeks later, the unit entered a phase of reduced operations, not due to lack of enemy activity but due to logistical realignment in preparation for future offensives. During this time, he found himself supporting the work of maintenance teams. He inspected transmissions, helped calibrate turret rotation mechanisms, and assisted with track alignment. Though these tasks were not glamorous, he approached them with seriousness. He knew that in the coming months, the difference between a functioning vehicle and a malfunctioning one might determine whether a crew lived or died. Despite the relative quiet of this period, the front was never truly silent. Occasional artillery rounds reminded everyone that enemy forces remained vigilant. Patrols continued to identify concealed anti-tank positions. Scouting parties returned with intelligence on movements within enemy lines. The tension remained ever present, even when no major engagements occurred. During these weeks of preparation, he was occasionally summoned to speak with replacement crews newly assigned to the battle group. These informal briefings were not part of any official instructional program, yet officers recognized his experience as valuable. He explained the realities of battlefield conditions, the heat inside a sealed tank turret, the delay between pulling a lever and seeing its effect, the disorientation caused by smoke inside the crew compartment. He emphasized the importance of constantly monitoring the sound of the engine for signs of malfunction and spoke about the necessity of distributing tasks evenly during long operations to prevent exhaustion. His manner was steady and restrained. He never attempted to frighten the newcomers or impress them with stories. He provided them with tools for survival. Some of these crews later credited his words with preparing them for their first encounters with the enemy, though he never sought such acknowledgement. His goal was singular: to ensure that as many men as possible understood the dangers they faced. As weeks turned into months, the battle group gradually shifted from defensive readiness to renewed offensive preparations. Supplies increased, new vehicles arrived, and strategic briefings became more frequent. The command staff reviewed maps endlessly, marking potential routes of advance and identifying possible strongpoints of enemy resistance. Rumors circulated about major operations in other sectors, fueling speculation that a turning point in the war might be approaching. He participated in reconnaissance patrols designed to evaluate terrain for upcoming maneuvers. These missions required navigating forests, hills, and ravines to determine which areas could support tank movement and which posed unacceptable risks. He noted soil density, water saturation, the presence of obstacles, and potential lines of fire. These observations informed decisions that later shaped the success or failure of armored advances. During one such patrol, his crew encountered an abandoned enemy tank partially submerged in a ditch. Its exterior was marked by holes from small-caliber fire, but no major penetration was visible. The hatches were open. Inside, the compartments were charred, likely from an internal fire started by mechanical failure or ammunition mishandling. He studied the interior carefully, noting how quickly conditions must have deteriorated to force the crew to abandon their positions. He saw in that wreck a mirror of his own experience and recognized that the same fate could have befallen him had circumstances been only slightly different. By the time the battle group received formal orders for its next major operation, he had regained full confidence in his physical capabilities and in his new crew. The burns had healed into faint scars. The residual effects of smoke inhalation had diminished. The tank felt familiar beneath his hands. He was ready for what lay ahead. The transition from recovery and preparation to active engagement marked a turning point in his war experience. What followed would be months of intense operations, rapid advances, and occasional defensive stands, events that would eventually lead into the final stage of the war described in the second part of the narrative. After returning to active duty, he found that time at the front moved differently for men who had seen their tank burn from within. There was no dramatic transformation and no sudden elevation in status. Instead, there was a subtle shift in how he carried himself and how others viewed him. He became the man who did not panic when the sky filled with artillery fire, who did not raise his voice in moments of crisis, who did not rush when others rushed. Experience had tempered him in ways visible only to those who had shared the same environment of steel, smoke, and fire. He continued to serve in armored units through some of the most demanding phases of the war. By then he had operated several different tanks, each with its own engineering characteristics, vulnerabilities, and quirks. Instructors and engineers improved designs as lessons were learned in the field. Armor plating changed composition and thickness. Ammunition storage was reorganized to reduce catastrophic explosions. Fire suppression systems were modified. Although these improvements increased survivability, tank warfare remained one of the most lethal assignments, especially for crews operating in heavily defended sectors. As his years of service accumulated, he gained a deep understanding of the relationship between human endurance and mechanical reliability. A tank could only perform as well as its crew, and a crew could only perform as well as its training, cohesion, and ability to remain focused despite exhaustion. He often found himself inspecting equipment late into the night, ensuring that every bolt was tightened, every hose checked for leaks, every tool accounted for. He encouraged younger crewmen to do the same, not through authority but through quiet example. They saw that he treated maintenance not as a chore but as a form of self-preservation. The war moved into phases marked by both rapid advances and fierce defensive battles. His unit was sometimes deployed for offensive thrusts designed to break enemy lines and sometimes assigned to hold specific positions against counterattacks. Each type of operation brought its own dangers. Offensive actions required crossing open terrain where enemy gunners could track movement. Defensive operations required maintaining positions even when enemy artillery pounded them relentlessly. His units suffered losses from time to time, as all armored units did. Some tanks were disabled by direct hits, others by mines or mechanical failure under fire. The names of fallen crewmen accumulated in the unit's records. Though he tried not to dwell on them, he never forgot the faces of those he had served with, or the silence that followed the destruction of a tank. The absence of voices, the empty place at a meal, the sudden need to train a replacement, these were the everyday reminders of the dangers they all faced. During one prolonged campaign, he was assigned temporary duty as an advisor to a newly arrived battle group. Many of the crews were fresh from training, possessing enthusiasm but lacking practical knowledge. He conducted familiarization talks with them, walking them through the types of threats they would face, the patterns of enemy anti-tank deployment, and the critical need to trust one another implicitly. He described the noise and heat inside a tank during combat, the sensation of a near miss, and the disorientation caused by shock waves. These weren't tales meant to frighten them but to ground their expectations in reality. He also explained what happened to his own tank months earlier, relating the experience in plain terms. He did not emphasize his own actions, he emphasized the chain of events and the lessons to be learned. The younger men listened closely. Some asked logistical questions afterward, seeking clarification on mechanical or operational details. A few approached him privately to ask how one found the resolve to act under such conditions. His answer was always the same: resolve came not from bravery but from responsibility to those serving beside you. As the war deepened and casualty lists lengthened, the psychological strain became increasingly apparent. Crews who had fought through multiple engagements often displayed signs of fatigue that went beyond physical weariness. Reaction times slowed. Tempers shortened. Men became withdrawn. Commanders tried to rotate units whenever possible, but the demands of the front meant that rest periods were often brief or cut short. He coped with the strain through routine and discipline. The maintenance of the tank provided structure to his days. The predictability of mechanical tasks helped quiet the unpredictability of warfare. He also found stability in the camaraderie that formed within each crew. Though the faces changed over time, the bond remained constant. Tank crews developed a shared language of gestures, glances, and habits. They relied on these silent forms of communication when noise or danger made speech impossible. In one winter operation, his unit was tasked with holding a narrow stretch of forest road critical for supply lines. The roads were icy, the visibility poor, and temperatures dropped dangerously low at night. Tanks struggled to maneuver, and crews took turns running engines at intervals to prevent fuel lines from freezing. Enemy artillery occasionally targeted the road, forcing crews to take cover and hope that no direct hits would occur. Despite the harsh conditions, the unit held its position, enabling supply convoys to reach frontline infantry. During that deployment, he again encountered the reality that armor protection was relative. One night, while patrolling near the vehicles, he heard the distinct sound of an artillery shell detonating nearby. A tank at the edge of the formation had taken a hit. Flames began to emerge from the engine compartment. The crew scrambled to extinguish the fire before it spread. He assisted, helping to direct fire suppressants and clear damaged debris. They succeeded in saving the tank from total destruction, though the damage required extensive repairs. Incidents like this reinforced the unpredictability of threat and reminded him that even outside of active engagements, danger was constant. As the front lines shifted and eventually began to move in favor of his side, there was a cautious sense of progress. Reports circulated of successful operations elsewhere, suggesting that the tide of war might be turning. Yet tank crews remained acutely aware that final victory would require many more battles and that any day might still be their last. In the final year of the war, his unit participated in several operations aimed at exploiting enemy retreats and disrupting defensive fallback positions. These operations demanded rapid movement, long hours in cramped compartments, and near-constant vigilance. Mechanical breakdowns were frequent due to the pace of the advance. Crews worked tirelessly to keep vehicles operational. The stress on engines, tracks, and weapons was immense. During one of these operations, his tank became temporarily immobilized due to track damage sustained during a nighttime maneuver over rough ground. While awaiting recovery, he and his crew fortified their position and coordinated with nearby infantry. The enemy launched several probing attacks during this period, but the defensive line held. When a repair team finally arrived, he assisted in the restoration process, demonstrating his deep knowledge of field repairs. Within hours, the tank was operational again. He continued to serve until the final large-scale operations were concluded and enemy forces were either defeated, captured, or forced into disorganized retreat. When the war finally ended, the sense of relief was accompanied by exhaustion. There were no celebrations for men like him, at least not immediately. The first emotions were disbelief, followed by a cautious acceptance that the constant danger was finally over. Demobilization occurred gradually. He attended briefings on the transition to peacetime, completed necessary administrative procedures, and surrendered his equipment. Returning to civilian life was both a comfort and a challenge. The daily habits of war did not disappear easily. Loud noises startled him. The smell of diesel fuel triggered memories. He found it difficult to speak about the war in detail, even with those who asked sincerely. He preferred to let the past remain unspoken unless context required explanation. Years later, when contacted by historians or veterans associations, he agreed to provide statements about his experiences. His accounts were factual, concise, and free of dramatization. He described engagements, logistical challenges, and the nature of tank warfare. When asked about the rescue from the burning tank, he explained it plainly, emphasizing the sequence of events rather than any emotional interpretation. He said he acted because 2 men were inside, and he would not have been able to live with himself had he left them. He always noted that countless others had done similar things and that he was merely one example among many. Veterans who served with him described him as dependable, calm, and impossibly steady under pressure. Some mentioned that they felt safer knowing he was nearby. Others recalled his willingness to share knowledge without condescension. His presence in a crew was seen as a stabilizing force. He rarely raised his voice, and he never sought recognition. As archival documentation expanded in the post-war decades, his actions were occasionally cited in studies of armored warfare. Military analysts pointed to his incident as an example of how strict regulations sometimes collided with battlefield realities. They discussed the psychological factors that led crew members to risk their lives for one another, and they used his case to illustrate the human dimension of armored operations, which too often focused solely on tactics and technology. In gatherings of veterans, his story was remembered without embellishment. Those who had served with him spoke not of heroism but of duty carried out under extreme conditions. They emphasized that tank crews were often put in situations where no regulation could fully dictate the correct action, and that survival frequently depended on improvisation and instinct. In later life, he maintained correspondence with several former crew members, including the commander and loader he had rescued. Both had survived their injuries and had lived to build families and careers after the war. Their letters often expressed gratitude but never in a way that made him uncomfortable. They wrote of memories, shared experiences, and the way their lives had unfolded. He responded in kind, always modest, always focusing on the collective rather than the individual. He lived long enough to see historians develop a deeper appreciation for the human stories within armored warfare. Museums began to display restored tanks from his era, and he sometimes visited these exhibits. When he stood beside those restored vehicles, he saw not the polished steel of peacetime displays but the raw, scarred machines he remembered, hot, loud, and always in motion. He could still feel the vibrations of engines through the soles of his boots, still recall the smell of oil and cordite. His children and grandchildren asked him about the war, and he answered selectively. He described the camaraderie, the discipline, and the technical challenges. He avoided discussing the worst moments unless they insisted. When he finally told them about the day he returned to his burning tank, he gave them the same version he gave everyone else, simple, direct, and stripped of heroics. He told them that fear was present, but so was duty. He said the real measure of a man was not the absence of fear but the ability to act despite it. Historians who later revisited the records of his unit found that his experience fit within a broader pattern of armored warfare across all nations involved in the conflict. Reports from Soviet, British, American, and German units all contained accounts of crew members who re-entered burning tanks to save comrades. These acts transcended national boundaries. They demonstrated a universal truth: within the confined space of a tank, the bond between crew members was unbreakable. Each man depended on the others entirely. The decision to risk one's life for a comrade was not driven by political ideology but by the deeply human impulse to protect those with whom one shared the most dangerous of environments. His own story became one example among many, representing the countless acts of courage that occurred without witness or record. The majority of such incidents were never documented formally, either because no one survived to describe them or because they were overshadowed by larger events. For every story that found its way into archives, there were dozens lost to time. In his later years, he sometimes reflected on how close death had come to him that day. He acknowledged privately that he might easily have perished inside the tank. He understood that his survival had depended on timing, luck, and the resilience of his body. Yet he never regretted his actions. He believed firmly that a man's life was measured not by how long he lived but by how he treated those around him. Saving his comrades gave him peace, not pride. As he aged, his war memories remained vivid but less intrusive. He spent more time with family, pursued quiet hobbies, and enjoyed the tranquility that had been so rare during his youth. When he passed away, he left behind not medals or accolades but a legacy of integrity. Those who knew him remembered him as a man who did what was right without hesitation, even when doing so violated procedure and endangered his own life. His story, preserved through military archives and the recollections of those he saved, serves as a reminder of the human dimension of armored warfare. Tanks are powerful machines, but their true strength lies in the men inside them. The fire, the noise, the smoke, and the danger cannot be understood without acknowledging the courage, loyalty, and resilience that bind a crew together. In the decades since the war, historians, veterans, and military scholars have recognized that acts like his were not isolated. Across battlefields in Europe, Asia, and Africa, countless tank crews faced similar moments of crisis. Some survived, others did not. But the pattern remained consistent: when the metal walls of a tank turned into a furnace, the decisions made inside reflected the deepest instincts of the human spirit. His actions stand not as a story of individual heroism but as a testament to what ordinary men can do when placed in extraordinary circumstances. His return to a burning tank defied regulations but upheld a higher code shared by all who fought together in confined steel spaces. It demonstrated that even in the most brutal forms of warfare, humanity could prevail in a single, decisive moment. For those who study the war today, his story offers insight into the complexities of armored combat. It shows that survival was not only a matter of engineering and tactics but also of trust, courage, and the willingness to risk everything for another person. His experience continues to resonate because it captures a universal truth, that in war, as in life, the greatest acts are often the ones performed quietly, without expectation of recognition, driven solely by loyalty and conscience. In remembering him, we honor not just one man but all the tankers who served in the Second World War. Their service took place inside machines designed for destruction, yet their actions often revealed the highest qualities of human character. His story endures because it is real, because it happened not as a legend but as an event witnessed and recorded, and because it reflects the lived experience of thousands whose names will never appear in any history book. In the end, his legacy is defined not by fire or steel but by the simple truth that he did not abandon those who depended on him. The world changed after the war, but the meaning of what he did has not. It remains a quiet, enduring example of courage, a reminder that even in the darkest moments of history, individuals can choose compassion over fear, duty over safety, and loyalty over self-preservation.